Would you please pray with me? Loving God, you have so made us that we cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from your mouth. Give us a hunger for your word, and in that food satisfy our daily need. Amen. If given the option of reflecting on his life in one of the two following ways, I wonder which Moses would choose. Would he choose to begin his reflection with, "Everything I've ever done has led me to where I find myself today"? Or, "It is only after many surprises and choices, detours and disappointments that I have arrived somewhere I could never have anticipated"? At the end of his life, standing there on Mount Nebo, looking out upon the grand panorama of the promised land, which everyone but he would enter, what would Moses have thought? Surely our lives consist of surprises, opportunities, detours, and disappointments that we could never have anticipated. And yet our lives can also be purposeful, purpose-driven even. Moses' life was certainly both. By no choice of his own, Moses was born a slave and raised a prince. As a young man, he came upon a slave being beaten by an Egyptian, and intervening, Moses struck the Egyptian, killing him. And the very next day, Moses came upon two Hebrew slaves fighting. And again, he intervened, challenging the aggressor. When the aggressor seemed to know that Moses had killed an Egyptian, Moses fled so as to not be caught for the crime. Having escaped into the Midian desert, Moses came upon shepherds harassing the daughters of Jericho, and again he intervened to rescue them. Every time Moses accidentally came upon those who were weaker being exploited by those who were stronger, he chose to protect the weak. Perhaps God gave Moses this impulse. Certainly, God used it. In time, God seems to have channeled it into a God-given purpose for Moses' life, to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt so that they could freely worship God in the promised land. Today we heard the poignant scene from the final chapter of Moses' life. It is poignant not only because Moses is the greatest prophet of Israel and that he dies, but also because he dies outside the promised land. After all the travail of his life, of always intervening on the side of the powerless, of going up against Pharaoh, of leading the Israelites out of Egypt, of spending 40 years in the wilderness, the time needed for the generation that had been raised in slavery to give way to a generation born in freedom, Moses stands now at the threshold of their destination. And while all the Israelites cross over, Moses stays behind by himself. And somewhere, we don't know where, outside the promised land, Moses dies. That Moses was denied access to the land toward which his whole life had been directed by God seems to be an unfulfillment of the highest order. And frankly, rather than rush into the promised land, I feel a pull to linger with him as long as I can. Moses is the kind of person that I would stick with and follow anywhere. He is the kind of leader who is faithful to a purpose so great that he understands it is not about himself or about his interests. He is unlike all the Israelites who are ready and willing to be organized around their own interests, to be led out of Egypt so that they could be freed from oppression, to return to Egypt, to avoid the hardships and insecurities of life in the wilderness, to sacrifice their gold jewelry for the creation of a golden idol so that they could at least worship something, and to make their way into a foreign land where they are told they will enjoy security, progeny, and prosperity. None of these would have been easy to undertake, but they were willing in service to their interests. Moses is the only one who does not act out of self-interest. God counts on him to conduct himself and to make decisions in the interest of God. What does it look like to conduct oneself and to lead others to conduct themselves in the interest of God? For some sense of this, I think we can look to the 10 Commandments that Moses received from God to give to the people. These commandments, insofar as they prohibited murder, theft, and adultery, were not novel. Other societies, too, outlawed these things. What the 10 Commandments introduced, however, was a word and a concept that was not found in any earlier or neighboring law code. That word was don't. And that concept was that there are some things that are simply wrong. The law codes of earlier and neighboring peoples were formulated differently. For example, if someone were to kill a person, the following punishment would ensue. If someone were to damage the property of another, such and such would be the punishment. While such case laws do appear later in the Hebrew Bible, the 10 Commandments introduced the novel concept that there are some things that we should or should not do, not in order to receive a reward or to avoid a punishment, but simply because some things are right or wrong. In other words, the 10 Commandments introduced the moral idea that there should be some limits to our very human tendency to conduct ourselves and to organize society around our interests. We all have interests, and we have a right to pursue them. We all organize our personal and family affairs around our interests. It's called the pursuit of happiness. But nevertheless, according to biblical law, some things are simply wrong and limits need to be set. I think of Moses at the end of his life, this man who had climbed to the mountaintop to bring the law of God to his people. Having equipped the Israelites with this divine moral law, Moses knew that his God-given purpose was complete. I imagine, too, that in that moment, when Moses stayed behind outside the promised land, while everyone else crossed into it, he recognized something that everyone else may have missed. That God's gift of the law, not of the land, would be foundational to the future of God's people. God's commandments would give them a future with hope. As followers of Jesus and as heirs of the legacy of the Protestant Reformation, we have inherited an approach to the 10 Commandments that allows for ongoing interpretation. Living at a time when there were competing interpretations of Jewish law, Jesus offered an interpretation that summarized the law into the commandment to love God with all one's heart, mind, strength, and soul, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. Centuries later, the Protestant reformer John Calvin thought he was applying Jesus' summary of the Ten Commandments when he argued that every commandment not to do something could be extrapolated into commandments of what we are to do for God and for our neighbor. So the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," is also a commandment to be concerned with the safety of all people. Calvin went on to say that any violence, injury, or harmful thing that may injure our neighbor's body is forbidden for all. Jesus and the reformers were concerned to know the loving spirit of the law. And since they understood the law to be written on our hearts, it could be carried across any threshold into any land, anywhere that God's people were. No longer tied to a mountaintop where God was once thought to reside, and no longer tied to a traveling ark, and no longer tied to the land promised by God, God's law was always to be with the people, interpreted and applied for God's loving use. What we have learned from Jesus and the Protestant reformers is that just reform of institutions likely requires new interpretations, new applications of law. The reforms that Jesus championed in his solidarity with those who were weak, exploited, and left out, and the Protestant Reformation were not only religious in nature, they sparked revolution in law. This is one of the far-reaching impacts of the Protestant Reformation on society. To love God with all one's heart, mind, strength, and soul, and to love one's neighbor as oneself inevitably leads to ongoing, rigorous reformation. If this commandment is to be the key to interpreting all other laws, the Reformed Church will always be reforming. While Moses may not yet have known, the Reformers knew there would never be a day when this work would be finished. Amen.